A young woman sits on the lower level of a stone house in a hill town swollen with strangers. It is not her home. It is not even a proper room. It is the space where the family keeps its animals at night, cut into the ground below the main floor, the air thick with straw and warm breath. She is in labor. Above her, where the family should be resting, there is no space left. The town is crowded. Every relative, every distant cousin, every descendant of an ancient king has come home for a census. So she has been moved down, into the lower room, where a stone trough sits carved into the floor, worn smooth by the mouths of oxen and donkeys for who knows how many years. You already know this story. Or you think you do? You have seen it in nativity plays. You have seen it on Christmas cards, painted gold and soft, a wooden cradle tucked neatly beside a barn door. But the actual Greek word Luke uses for that feeding trough is not decoration. It is a signal. And here is the part almost nobody notices. That word, the Greek word for manger appears exactly 4 times in the entire New Testament. Not 5, not 10, 4. And every single time, one man wrote it. The same author, the same choice. 3 times in this birth story alone, packed into 10 verses, as if he could not stop circling back to it. That is not an accident. Writers do not repeat a rare word by accident, especially not ancient writers, who chose every phrase with the weight of a man carving stone. Stay with me, because this word is about to become the key that unlocks the entire story. Not the stable, not the innkeeper who turns them away in your imagination, but who does not actually exist in the text. The word. This is not a story about a stable. This is not a story about poverty. This is not a story about bad luck at the worst possible time. This is a story about a word, one the writer would not let go of, one an angel would use as a sign, and one that reaches all the way back into a prophecy written 700 years before this night. You are about to find out why a feeding trough became the most specific address on earth, and why the people closest to the answer, the ones with the scriptures, the ones with the scrolls, the ones who could have told you exactly where the Messiah would be born, never once got up to go look. But we and Apos, get to them. First, you need to understand the room this child was actually born into. Let Apos, let's go back a little further. Back before the trough. Back to the road. Mary and Joseph are not from Bethlehem. They live north, in Nazareth, a small town with no reputation and no importance to anyone outside it. But Joseph is from the line of David, and Rome has ordered a census. Every man counted in his ancestral town. So they travel roughly 90 miles on foot and by donkey, Mary heavily pregnant, down through hill country toward a town called Bethlehem. By the time they arrive, the town is packed. Every relative of David and Apos' ancient bloodline has come home for the same reason. And Luke tells us something here that most translations have quietly gotten wrong for centuries. Not through carelessness, but because language shifts and old words drift from their original meaning. Luke writes that there was no room for them in the kataluma, For generations, that word was translated and preachers built entire sermons around a cold-hearted innkeeper slamming a door in a pregnant woman and Apos' face. But here in Apos, that's what most people miss. The Greek word for a commercial inn, the kind of building with paying guests and a stranger at the desk, is a completely different word. It and Apos, the word Luke himself uses later, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, for the roadside and where the wounded man is cared for. Kataluma is not that word. Kataluma means guest room, upper room, the same word Luke uses later for the room where Jesus eats his final Passover meal with his disciples. So picture it differently. Joseph likely has relatives in Bethlehem. After all, this is the ancestral town of his entire family line. He is not a stranger banging on a random door. He is a son of this town, arriving to a household that is already packed with family, the guest room already full of other relatives who made the same journey. There is no space in the room set aside for guests. But in a typical Judean hill country home of this era, and we know this partly from the writings of the first-century Jewish historian Josephus, who described the domestic architecture of towns exactly like this one, the family and Apos' living space sat on a raised platform, and just below it, on the lower level, was where they brought the animals in at night. Not out of neglect. Out of protection, for warmth, for safety, for practicality. One house, 2 levels. Family above, animals below. There was no stable in a field. There was no barn down the road. There was only this house, already full, and a lower room already prepared with straw, water, and one particular piece of furniture carved right into the stone floor. The trough. And here in Apos, that's what most people miss about that trough. It becomes the safest, most sensible place in the entire house to lay a newborn. Not because the family didn't in Apos, take care. Because they did. A stone feeding trough, lined with fresh straw, is the closest thing in that lower room to a cradle. So Mary gives birth. And she does what any mother in her position would do. She wraps her son in strips of cloth, tucks him into the trough, and for the first time in human history, God is laid to rest in a feeding place. Now hold that thought, because a few miles away, on a dark hillside, something else is happening, and it will change how you see this trough forever. Out in the fields near Bethlehem, a group of shepherds are keeping watch over their flock through the night. Shepherds occupy a strange place in Jewish society of this time, vital to the economy, essential to temple sacrifice, and yet often looked down on, considered too rough, too unreliable to even testify in court. These are not men anyone expected news from heaven to visit. And then the sky breaks open. Light floods the field. A messenger of God stands before them, and the shepherds are terrified, not a polite kind of surprised, but the knee-buckling, breath-stealing kind of fear that comes from standing in front of something too large for a human mind to hold. And the angel says, "Do not be afraid." Then the angel gives them titles that no one in Israel had spoken so plainly in centuries. Savior, Christ, the Anointed One, the Promised King. Lord, a word reserved, in their scriptures, almost exclusively for God himself. And then the angel gives them a sign. Not a miracle in the sky, not a chorus of light. A sign so specific, so plain, that there could be no mistake. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger. That word again. The same rare word. The exact word Luke has already used once, and is about to use twice more. This is where it gets remarkable. Of every child born in Bethlehem that week, and there would have been others, in an ordinary town going about ordinary life, there was exactly one baby lying in a feeding trough. It was not a coincidence that could be confused. It was an address. A location no other family in Bethlehem would have chosen, because no other family needed to. The shepherds run, not walk. Run, leaving their flock, leaving their livelihood unguarded in the dark, because a sign this specific demanded a response this immediate. They find Mary, they find Joseph, and they find the baby, lying exactly where the angel said he would be, lying in the manger. 3 times now, 3 times in 10 verses, Luke has used this same rare word, the word that appears nowhere else in his entire gospel except once, years later, in an offhand comment Jesus makes about untying an ox from its stall to give it water. Why does Luke keep circling back to it? Hold that thought a little longer. Because the answer isn and apos, t in Bethlehem at all. It and apos, s buried 700 years earlier, in a single verse from a prophet named Isaiah. And once you see it, you will never read the Christmas story the same way again. So let and apos, s pause here for a second. One word, repeated on purpose, by one writer, at the most important moment in human history. If that kind of detail catches your attention, the kind buried in plain sight for 2,000 years, this channel exists for exactly that. Every video here takes one word, one phrase, one overlooked detail from scripture, and follows it all the way to the bottom. If you want the next one delivered straight to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are just getting to the part that changes everything. Because that word, the manger, didn't and apos, t start with Luke. Luke didn't and apos, t invent it. He was quoting something. And the moment you see what he was quoting, this whole night in Bethlehem stops looking like an accident of bad timing, and starts looking like something planned before the foundation of the world. Let and apos, let's talk about the wrapping first, because this detail gets misread almost as often as the end quote, does. You and apos, v. You probably heard it preached that the swaddling cloths are a symbol of poverty, a desperate mother with nothing better to offer her son. But the Greek word Luke uses here, sparganou, simply means to wrap a baby tightly in strips of cloth. It was completely ordinary. Every mother in that culture, rich or poor, wrapped her newborn this way. To keep the baby warm, to keep tiny limbs straight, to help the child feel secure after 9 months in a much smaller space. It was an act of care, not an act of desperation. Mary is not doing anything unusual here. She is doing exactly what every mother around her would have done for her child that same week. Here and Apos. That's the part nobody tells you, though. Some teachers have taken this scene and built an entire theory on top of it. A theory about a place called Migdal-Eder, a watchtower where shepherds were said to raise and inspect the lambs destined for temple sacrifice, supposedly using strips of cloth to keep those lambs unblemished. The theory says that, and Apos, where Jesus was born, the Tower of the Flock, the birthplace of sacrificial lambs, wrapped in the same cloth used for the Lamb of God. It and Apos, a beautiful image, and it might even be true in spirit. But there is no ancient document that actually places the manger at that tower. It is a guess dressed up as history. And when you set that theory aside, not because it and Apos, wrong to imagine it, but because it is in and Apos, what the text actually claims, you and Apos, left with something better. Something you don and Apos, have to guess at. Something written down 7 centuries earlier in black and white. Bethlehem itself holds part of the answer. In Hebrew, the name Bethlehem means, and quote, house of bread, and quote, not house of shepherds, not house of sacrifice, house of bread. This is the same town where, generations earlier, a Moabite widow named Ruth gleaned grain in the fields of a man named Boaz, the very ancestors of the king whose descendant would one day be born here. This is the town the prophet Micah pointed to, centuries before Luke ever picked up a pen, saying that out of Bethlehem, small, forgettable, easy to overlook, would come the one who would rule Israel. A house of bread, a ruler born in a feeding trough. Do you see where this is going yet? But it gets stranger. Because the deepest root of this whole story is in and Apos, in Micah. It and Apos, in a verse from Isaiah that most people read once, in passing, and never connect to Christmas at all. 700 years before Mary ever wrapped her son in cloth, the prophet Isaiah stood before the nation of Israel and delivered a single line of devastating grief. He said, "The ox knows its owner, and the donkey knows its master and Apos, manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand." Read that again, slowly. An ox knows its owner. A donkey, a working animal, unremarkable, unintelligent by every measure people used to judge intelligence back then, still knows exactly where to find food, exactly who feeds it, exactly where home is. But God and Apos, own people, the ones given the law, the ones given the prophets, the ones given every possible advantage to recognize their own God, they do not know him. They do not understand. That and Apos, not really a verse about farm animals. It and Apos, an indictment. Isaiah is saying that the least intelligent creatures on earth have a clearer relationship with the one who feeds them than God and Apos, chosen people have with their own God. And now hold every piece of that in your mind, because we and Apos, about to bring it back to a lower room in Bethlehem, a mother wrapping her son in cloth, and one word that Luke would not stop repeating. Here and Apos, what most people miss about that verse from Isaiah. When Jewish scholars, centuries before Jesus was born, sat down to translate their Hebrew scriptures into Greek, a translation called the Septuagint, the Bible most ordinary people in the Roman world actually read, they came to that word in Isaiah. The Hebrew word for, end quote, manger, end quote, ibis. And they had to choose a Greek word to carry that meaning forward. They chose fatten, the exact word, the same rare word Luke would use 3 times 700 years later to describe a feeding trough in a lower room in Bethlehem. The same word that appears nowhere else in his entire gospel except once, in a passing comment about untying an ox from its stall. This is not a coincidence anyone stumbled into. This is not a detail Luke happened to reach for because it was the nearest word available. This is not an accident of translation. This is a physician and historian, writing decades after the fact, deliberately reaching back into Isaiah and Apos' condemnation of Israel. The ox knows its owner, the donkey knows its master and Apos' manger, but Israel does not know, and placing the newborn Messiah directly inside that exact word. Do you see it now? Isaiah said Israel didn't and Apos' recognize its master at the manger. And 700 years later, God places his own son in a manger, as if to say, "Here I am again. Here is the manger. This time will you know me?" And the tragedy is, some did, and some didn't. And Apos. Bethlehem sits roughly 5 miles from Jerusalem, 5 miles from the temple, 5 miles from rooms full of scribes and teachers of the law who had spent their entire lives studying the very scroll that named this town, Micah and Apos, as prophecy, sitting right there in their libraries, ready to be quoted the moment King Herod later asks them where the Messiah would be born. They know the address. They have known it for centuries, and not one of them makes the 5-mile walk that night. Meanwhile, out in a field, a group of shepherds, men with no formal training, no scrolls, no seat in any synagogue of influence, hear a sign, get up and run. The distance between knowing and going was 5 miles, and it might as well have been the distance between heaven and earth. Now think about what that means for a mother in a lower room, still holding her newborn son, unaware of any of this. She doesn't and Apos, T know she and Apos, as fulfilling Isaiah. She doesn't and Apos, T know her ordinary act of wrapping her baby in cloth, laying him in the nearest safe place she can find, will be studied for 2,000 years. She and Apos, S just doing what a mother does. She and Apos, S just trying to keep her son warm. That is how God so often works. Not through the dramatic gesture people expect, but through an ordinary mother doing an ordinary thing, in an ordinary room, on a night that only looks unremarkable if you don and Apos, T know what you and Apos, re-looking at. And here is where the story reaches all the way to the end of his life, because Luke ISN and Apos, T finished with this pattern. 33 years later, on a hill outside Jerusalem, that same body, grown now, beaten, killed, will be taken down and wrapped again. Not in swaddling cloths this time, but in linen, prepared for burial. And he will be laid, once more, in a place that is not his own. Not a womb, not a cradle, a borrowed feeding trough at the beginning, a borrowed tomb at the end, wrapped at the start of his life, wrapped at the end of it, laid in a space built for something else entirely, both times, because he never once, in his whole life, took up a space that was built to hold him. He was always laid in what belonged to someone else, because he came to give away everything that was his. And years after that, grown into a man, Jesus stands in front of a crowd and says something that finally explains why the trough was never a coincidence. He says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever." Bethlehem, house of bread. A newborn, laid in a feeding trough. A man, decades later, calling himself the bread that feeds the world forever. This is not a story about a stable. This is not a story about poverty. This is not a story about a mother who had nowhere else to go. This is a story about a God who chose, on purpose, to place his son in the exact object Isaiah had used 700 years earlier to describe the ache of being unknown by his own people, and who is still asking, in every generation since, "Will you know me this time?" So what do you do with all of this? 3 things. 3 things worth carrying with you long after this video ends. First, the truth. The manger was never an accident. It was never a symbol of poverty or bad luck or a careless innkeeper. It was a deliberate sign, chosen by God before Mary ever packed a bag for Bethlehem, reaching all the way back to a prophet and Apos' grief 700 years earlier. Nothing about that first night was improvised. Second, what it means for you. Recognizing him was never about having more information. The scribes in Jerusalem had the information. They had the scrolls, the prophecy, the address written in black ink. And it changed nothing, because knowledge without movement is just knowledge. The shepherds had almost nothing except a willingness to get up and go look. That is still the difference today. Not how much you know about him. Whether you and Apos, willing to go and see for yourself. Third, and this is the one I want you to sit with. The same hands that wrapped him in that trough would one day be wrapped again for a tomb. He entered the world laid in a feeding place. He left it laid in a borrowed grave. And in between those 2 moments, wrapped and wrapped again, he spent his whole life feeding people who were hungry in ways they couldn't and Apos, always name. He came to a house of bread, in a feeding trough, so that everyone who was ever starving for something they couldn't and Apos, buy or grow or earn would finally have somewhere to go. Which detail about the manger surprised you the most? Tell me below, I read every comment. Because 2,000 years later, the question Isaiah asked is still the only one that matters. The ox knows its owner. The donkey knows its master and Apos, Manger. Will you know yours?